this makes it our first international webinar. So thank you for being here. We've muted our attendees for the webinar, so please use the chat function to ask your questions. We'll be monitoring the chat. Wanda will be doing that and asking the presenters your questions. And now I'm going to introduce our presenters. Annie Jones began living her Kathleen Kelly dream in 2013 when she took over operations of the bookshelf in downtown Thomasville, Georgia. Annie adores leading story time for local little ones and acting as the shop's very own Nancy Drew, determined to find just the right book for just the right person. Annie also co-hosts From the Front Porch, the bookshelf's popular weekly podcast about books, small business, and life in the South. From the Front Porch hit its 1 millionth download in February 2019. And together, Annie and her co-host Chris have produced over 200 episodes. In 2016, Annie was featured as one of Southern Living Magazine's 50 Innovators Changing the South. Anne Bogle is the creator of the very popular blog, Modern Mrs. Darcy. Her book lists and reading guides have established her as a tastemaker among readers, authors, and publishers. Books are the foundation of her site, which has been affectionately dubbed a lifestyle blog for nerds. She's the author of I'd Rather Be Reading, The Delights and Dilemmas of the Reading Life, and Reading People, How Seeing the World Through the Lens of Personality Changes Everything. Her weekly podcast, What Should I Read Next?, is devoted to book talk, reading recommendations, and literary matchmaking. She's based in Louisville, Kentucky. Mitchell Kaplan founded Books and Books in Coral Gables, Florida in 1982. Has since opened numerous locations, including stores in Key West and the Cayman Islands. Books and Books was named Bookstore of the Year in 2015 by Publishers Weekly. Mitchell is a co-founder of the Miami Book Fair, the former president of the American Booksellers Association, and served on the board of ABFA, the American Booksellers Foundation for Free Expression. In 2011, Mitchell received the National Book Foundation's prestigious Literarian Award for Outstanding Service to the American literary community. His podcast is called The Literary Life, which features candid conversations with Mitchell and his guests. So we're going to begin with Mitchell. Welcome.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here. This is my very first one of these, so if I seem a little awkward, I apologize. And I thank you for accommodating me that I'm out of the country. I guess I'm kind of the new kid on the block with this podcast. Both Anne and Annie's podcasts are podcasts that I've really admired, and so I'm kind of honored to be on with them. I thought I would tell you a little bit about how mine started and why it started, and then a little bit about the philosophy behind what the podcast is and is going to be. We started it last June, so I think we've done about 30 episodes or 40 episodes, I can't quite remember. But I was approached. It wasn't something that I was looking for necessarily. But in Miami, we have actually it's a Spanish language television network called Univision. They happen to be based in Miami. But little did I know that they also had a podcast division, which they ran under the name Revolver. And one of their producers was a customer of ours. And she came to me and said, how would you like to do a podcast? And I've always loved radio. Radio is something that I've been a fan of ever since I was little. And so I thought, yeah, why not? And so they agreed to underwrite it, meaning obviously I got no money, but at least the producer was able to get something. And they handled the editing and all of that. So basically, all that I had to do really was show up and conduct a conversation. And then I got very involved ultimately in some of the editing as well. The podcast, when I started thinking about it, I decided that what I was going to do was sort of try to approximate as much as I could the life of a bookseller. And there are many more things that I want to be doing. But the very first thing I thought I would do is kind of have over the backyard fence kinds of conversations with various people and the authors that I came across, sometimes customers, even with some of my staff, buyers, the buying that I've done. And so that was kind of the idea. It was very unscripted. It continues to be unscripted. There's no real script, as you can tell when you listen to it. And I kind of let the conversations go where they will. Sometimes we talk more about the book of a particular author. Sometimes we'll talk more about who they are, because they've talked a lot about their book, or their book has been covered in many other places. We're very blessed in Miami that we get lots of authors coming through, so I'm able to do it with authors themselves. And nothing that I do is remote at this point. Most of the interviews have been interviews that have taken place right in the store. And I try to do them in the store. I'll often do them in our cafe, even between, we'll order food. Some of the comments we get is, the conversation's good, but I wish the author wouldn't munch as loud as they are munching, that kind of thing. But I'm having a blast. I can say that I'm really enjoying it. I don't know if it's impacting on sales. I can see on some of the online sales that are coming through, but I don't really use it as a promotion for Books and Books as much as I use it as a promotion for books and authors, because I want to buy in from everybody. I want the entire book community to be able to benefit from whatever it is that I'm doing. So I'm not looking to drive sales directly to the bookstore. That was never the purpose. In fact, I think of it as a kind of standalone thing, even though it takes place in the bookstore and that I'm with Books and Books. So I don't separate the two, but it's not something that I'm driving to do business. What's happened recently is, some of you might know that LitHub has developed LitHub Radio, and they asked us to join LitHub Radio. So the last two podcasts were in kind of transition. We've moved away from Revolver and we're going over to LitHub Radio. And it means that they'll basically just be hosting it, and they'll be doing some of the editing, and we'll be changing a number of things. We may be changing some of the format, the music, the look of the podcast. It was something that Revolver kind of controlled, and there's some changes that I wanted to make going forward. In the future, the kinds of things I want to do is I want to wire up booksellers and just go through the whole bookselling process. I want to do I want to get booksellers across the country. This is something I might do as a call-in, where I get booksellers across the country, do a kind of what are you reading session. I just have all kinds of ideas. We basically drop one a week. And they're going to be coming out on Friday. They used to come out on Saturday. The way we use them as promotional tools, not promotional tools, but the way we get the word out among our community in Miami is we basically include it in our newsletter. We include it on our website, that sort of thing. I don't know much about the analytics at this point. Revolver wasn't great about the analytics. I don't imagine that we've had our 1 millionth download yet. So I congratulate you for having that. That's quite a feat. But I know people are listening. A funny anecdote, a kind of embarrassing anecdote. I do the Miami Book Fair. So at the book fair, I was able to do a lot of different authors who came through there, but I couldn't do a lot because I'm involved with organizing it. And so I was taking a writer out. I was taking a writer out for dinner, and it happened to be Michael Ondaatje. He happened to be at the fair, and I took him to dinner with his wife. And we were at this restaurant, and I've lived in Miami and Miami Beach my whole life, so I know lots of different people. And so a woman comes up to the table, and she was very effusive, and I thought she was going to sort of give Michael a big hug, but instead she ignored him and said, "I love your podcast. I listen to it every week." Yada yada yada. I was terribly embarrassed by all of that, and so I know people are listening. I know it anecdotally more than anything else, but I'm happy to take your questions as we move forward. I can talk a little bit about technically what we do, but I don't do the technical side of it necessarily. But I've gotten involved in the editing where I'm listening, I'm sitting next to the editor and kind of trying to figure out getting my ums and ohs out of it and extra laughter. And I'm learning not to talk over someone else's conversation, that sort of thing. So I'm learning and I'm enjoying it immensely. And it's something that I highly recommend to all of you listening to experiment with. It's cheap, it's pretty easy, it's a lot of work, but it's fun. It's a lot of fun. It adds an extra dimension to what you're doing as well. Is that good, Linda Marie? Did I tell you anything?
That was great. Thank you. And I know that you may have to leave during our hour. So if people have questions for Mitchell, you can use the chat function and we'll ask them. But maybe we'll go on now to Ann Bogle.
I can stay for a fair amount. My flight got delayed, so
okay.
I was able to stay a fair amount.
Okay. All right, Ann.
I thought I was cleanup, but I can go now.
Yes.
Okay. Let me see if I can make this work. Well, now I feel like a big dork, but I have slides for you. Maybe. They're coming. Yay! Okay. All right. I have been podcasting since 2016, and what I'm going to do is share my story. If Linda Marie didn't say, I am the outlier here because I am not a bookseller. I've been to a ton of bookstores, which does not make me a bookseller. So I'm going to share my story of how I got into podcasting, what it means for my business, and you will know what to listen for and how it applies to your specific store, and then you can ask specific questions later. But podcasting is like water, meaning I found that this is a medium that will take as much as you give it and more. And so it's been really important to me to know going in, what do I want from it? How much time do I have for it? How can I make it work for me? Because otherwise it can take over your business and your life. Okay, so the impetus for my show was actually born from my blog. You can see this is the blog post that started it all. And it was really born out of, and I'm going to keep this part short because it's not about the podcasting, it's about the origin story, which might be interesting and all, but I got 12 minutes. But I started blogging in 2011, and I started eventually talking about books because I'm a book person and that's what we do. And I found that when you start talking about, well, what I found out was that people don't know what to read, and they look to people like us to help them. And if I had $1 for every time somebody emailed me and said, can you just give me a great book recommendation? I could buy us all brand new microphones and pay for our hosting for a year. But I'd say, well, I don't know. What do you like? And they'd say, no. You don't understand. Just tell me a great book to read. And I'd be like, well, reading is personal. So on a Sunday morning, I put up this blog post that said, hey, I've been thinking about this and I have an idea. People are looking for great books. Reading is personal. Why don't we try this? You can tell me 3 books you love, 1 book you don't, and what you're reading now. And I will recommend 3 titles you may enjoy reading next. I hated this as a blog series because I wish we were having a conversation that didn't unfold over email. And finally, 2 years later, it dawned on me that there's a way to do that, and it's called podcasting. So What Should I Read Next was born in January 2016, and we just published our 183rd episode yesterday. It comes out on Tuesdays. I think we don't publish on like Christmas and the 4th of July, but it comes out on all the other days. We are pushing 15 million downloads. People are always asking my husband, because he works in tech, hey, saw your wife's podcast on iTunes. That's not easy. What did you do? And he's like, well, the secret is to blog for 5 years before you launch a show. You all have bookstore mailing lists and an avid community of readers where you are. I imagine that would be helpful as well. But that was how I did it. so we're well established now. We have, I don't know, not as many ratings as Dax Shepard, but like people listen to our show. And our format, even since episode 1, has been very consistent. It's that same thing from 2014. People tell me 3 books they love, 1 book they don't, and what they're reading now. And I recommend 3 titles they may enjoy reading next. This is actually a form. This is a screenshot from our website, because part of our thing is we talk to regular readers week after week. And y'all, this is hard. So the podcast plays to my strength in many ways, because I know books, I know reading, I can make weird connections between things. I really enjoy that what do you want to read next conversation, just like you would have if you were hand selling in a bookstore. But we talk to people who are probably going to be on one podcast in their entire life, and it's ours. And they don't know how to do that, which is fine, but it's my job to help them be comfortable and keep the conversation interesting. You can probably describe books you love really easily, but most people need help to do that. Also, it's an interview show, which means I'm dependent on somebody else's schedule, have an appointment on my calendar I have to plan around, and we do it remotely. I'm really jealous of Mitchell. So that's What Should I Read Next? It's about an hour every Tuesday. But we just started. I am a new podcaster also, because we have this brand new show. It's called One Great Book. We're in like week 7. This seriously just started. It's totally different. It's a short form podcast. I pull 1 book off my personal bookshelves and tell you about it every week in 10 minutes or less. So this is a whole different thing to edit, to produce. It's a lot less work. It's a lot less time consuming, but it probably takes everybody involved 2 hours to produce about 8 minutes of content. And some of that is we have time constraints that you might not have, like advertising. And we do a lot to our audio. We is not the royal we. I have a team that does this. I create all the content myself, but I don't do the editing at this point or production. But it's a totally different format. If there's one thing I can say, like right now, is don't discount the short form podcast. It is short, but I've been really surprised at how many comments we've gotten from listeners who say, hey, podcasting is not new anymore. I have a lot that I listen to. I don't always have an hour. 7 minutes is perfect. So that was kind of surprising, but I was really happy to hear it. Hey, I checked today how we were doing on iTunes, because I'm talking to you all, and it launched almost 2 months ago, but just now, finally, we're in New and Noteworthy with Emma Watson. Okay. So I have 2 shows that they are very, very different, but I know that, actually, you know what? Let me go back. Starting a podcast is really time consuming. Podcasting is like water, again, that if you don't constrain it, then it just spills all over your life. I had the idea to start One Great Book a year ago. And the reason I wanted to do it was because I have talked to other podcasters and industry people who say, if you want to grow your mothership show, starting another show can be a very successful way to do it, because you can cross-pollinate. People will find One Great Book that don't already listen to What Should I Read Next? And you can end up getting both audiences elevated, which I'll get to why that matters for me in a minute. But I don't have time to make another podcast. I had a book come out last fall, and at the time I was thinking through ways of how am I going to market this book, and my publisher really wanted me to write like op-eds and magazine pieces and stuff like that, which I find enormously draining. And a friend said, hey, what if you took that time? Podcasting has been good for your business. What if you took that same time and invested it in a show, instead of all these one-off op-eds being run in other people's publications? And that is how I looked at it. So when I think of what does podcasting do for me, One Great Book is advertising for content I've already produced. What Should I Read Next? We'll get to that in a second. Okay, so my 2 shows are very different, but the core of them, of everything I do, really, it's important they all fit together, is bookish enthusiasm. So I strive to be a relatable expert. I know what I'm talking about. But we are not snobs, and we celebrate all kinds of readers. We feature regular readers. That's their phrase. I wouldn't call people regular readers, but non-experts, non-industry professionals, people who could be your mom, your neighbor, your babysitter, who get on the show because they love to read. And we feature a wide variety of people: taste, genre, age, country, race, gender. Like, we try to run the gamut week after week. But we want to celebrate reading and empower people to have better reading lives. So that's our unifying theme. And it's worked out really well for me. So these are my books. I'm a blogger and an author and a podcaster. And we make money through our show through advertising. So it's a significant source of income. We pay a lot of people a lot of money, but it generates a healthy full-time income on its own. Not like radiology money, but a decent income. And we just started a Patreon as well. I may have a shot of that somewhere. No, I don't. So more importantly, I've been surprised to find that what is good for the podcast is good for my business. It was a real shock to me to start going out on book tour for Reading People. And then I toured extensively for I'd Rather Be Reading. And we packed bookstores all over everywhere. And I didn't, this is Monkey and Dog in Fort Worth. I didn't realize when I set out on tour, but 90% of the people who showed up because of the podcast. The hands that went up were crazy. And what I found now in talking to people is that when people listen to your voice, and Mitchell hinted at this with his story of the woman who was so excited to meet, not the famous author, but him, because she listens to him week after week and she feels like she knows him. And it's not mutual, which can be kind of weird if you're a podcaster. I'm sure Annie knows this too, but your listeners feel like they know you and they want to come see you and they want to meet you in person. And also they want to see the places and stores that you talk about, and they want to read the books that you make them excited to read. So what I found is that when it comes to podcasting, it is the rising tide that lifts all. But here, I'm going to get rid of myself now. If you want to email me, my email address isn't on there. I'm Ann at modernmrsdarcy.com if you have specific questions, but I'm going to get rid of my thing now. Okay, so I found that what's good for the podcast is good for my business, because when people find out about the show and they listen, they read my blog, they buy my books, they tell their local bookseller to have me come visit. And of course we get that advertising revenue, but it's more important to me that they pay attention to whatever it is I'm doing. Also, something that I discounted about podcasting was that when I went into it, I played to my strengths. I knew what I was doing a little bit, but many days I feel like I know just enough to be dangerous. But when you do anything for 183 hours, you get a lot better at it. It's made me so much better at what I do just by doing it week after week after week. We are very clear about what we want, about who we want to have on the show. We are flooded with submissions from authors and publishing people who want to come on and promote their thing. But our thing is bookish enthusiasm, and we really celebrate the regular reader. And we know that that's what people want to hear, which is not there's tons of bookish podcasts that do different things for different reasons. Behind the scenes of the store, lots of author interviews, lots of very different tones, but we're very clear on what we do and what we want to get out of it. I love podcasting. It's been great for my business, but I also know that I've had booksellers on my show who say that being on my podcast, they didn't even have to buy a mic. We sent them mics. We send people $25 mics so we can have great audio quality, but they didn't have to start their own podcast to benefit. They've come on my show, and my friend in St. Louis says people walk through the door every day of the week. Some are local and found out about, because they just listened to episode 110 of What Should I Read Next that ran a year and a half ago, and found out that there's a bookstore in St. Louis they didn't know about. They'll be visiting somebody in town. They'll stop in. They'll take a road trip just to see this store because they've heard me talk about how I love it, and they've heard the owner on the podcast and they want to go see it for themselves. So being a guest could be a way to figure out if you like it, or could even get the job done without even figuring out how to use weird sounding tools like Audacity and Libsyn. But I hope that's helpful to you. I know I'm not the bookseller here, but I do know a lot about podcasting. And if we don't have time in the Q&A and you feel like you have a specific question, feel free to email me and I would be happy to help.
Thank you, Anne. I think you need to press stop share to stop sharing the screen.
Sorry.
Thank you. That was wonderful. So next up, we have Annie.
Share my.
I think you're still you're muted.
Oh, I unmuted. Can you hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So I wanted to share my screen. Can everybody see it? I can't see you anymore. So, okay. So I am the owner of The Bookshelf in Thomasville, Georgia, and I am the host of From the Front Porch, which is our store's weekly podcast on books, small business, and life in the South. I wanted to talk, much like Anne and Mitchell did, first about how we kind of got started and how the podcast morphed from there.
Annie,
Yes.
I can't see your screen. Am I the only one? I don't think you finished sharing. There you go.
There you go.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, so back 6 years ago, I took over The Bookshelf. The Bookshelf had been in existence for a long time, and I took over ownership about 6 years ago. And the previous owner suggested that one way to introduce myself to the Thomasville community — Thomasville is a small town — one way to introduce myself would be to start a podcast. And 6 years ago, podcasts were not new by any means, but new-ish. And so I'm the kind of person who, if you tell me to do something, I will immediately kind of run with it. So I Googled how to start a podcast. I watched a YouTube video. I read a blog post and designed a logo and thought, okay, here we go. So the previous owner and I began recording together. So we recorded 45-minute long to an hour-long episodes. We posted them twice a month. And it was really meant as a way for the previous owner to kind of pass the baton of store ownership onto me and to share, to kind of introduce me to this small town who didn't know who I was. It failed in that mission, like miserably. Nobody local listened to the podcast. I think now they do, but initially it was more of a fun project. And before I owned The Bookshelf, I was a writer and an editor, and I had a blog. It was not a big blog, but it was enough where I had a loyal following of readers, and that wound up being my first core listener base. So these turned out to not be people from Thomasville, not people familiar with The Bookshelf, people from all over the country kind of following along my journey to bookstore ownership. So after about 6 months, the previous owner was ready to kind of move on, and I had to decide, was the podcast going to be something I continue to do, or was it going to just drop off since it wasn't fulfilling its original mission and purpose? Ultimately, I decided to keep doing it because, as Mitchell said, it's fun. I really liked it, but I think that's something you'll need to consider as you decide whether or not this is something to try for your store. Is it something you enjoy because it's a lot of work? And is it something you can have fun doing? I ultimately did, and it was something I wanted to keep pursuing. So after 6 months of recording alongside Katie, the previous store owner, I took over the podcast completely and decided, as a podcast listener, what do I like about podcasts? And I like consistency, and I don't generally, there's a couple of exceptions to this, but I generally like 30 minutes. 30 minutes feels more doable than an hour. And so the podcast went from being 45 minutes every couple of weeks to weekly 30-minute episodes. Probably 2.5, 3 years, I was recording by myself, which is as awkward as it sounds. So I was recording alone about books I liked. I would occasionally have a guest from the community. But probably 2.5 years ago, one of my bookstore staffers showed an interest. He was a guest on the podcast, and we had a natural rapport. His name's Chris Jensen. He's a PhD candidate at Florida State, and it became apparent he might be a great co-host. So 2.5 years ago, he became co-host of From the Front Porch. And our podcast is primarily conversational. I love the rapport that Chris and I have, and the conversations that he and I have, I think, are a big draw to the podcast. But I also like knowing that when Chris ultimately graduates with his PhD and maybe moves on to other things, I'm still capable of running the podcast by myself. So Mitchell and Ann, it sounds like some other people maybe edit theirs for them. Chris currently edits and produces our podcast, but I did it for 3 years. So if the day comes when Chris moves on, I know the podcast won't die, I'll just take it over. And I'll find somebody else to delegate to. So it was very important to me that I know how to edit and produce the podcast. We record in GarageBand because that's what YouTube told me to do. So we record in GarageBand. We started off with a really tiny, cheap mic. Now we use a Yeti. Sure, I think there's a difference. We're never going to be NPR. So really, it's a pretty affordable marketing tool for our store. By being consistent, bringing on a co-host, and then Anne mentioned this, by cross-pollinating with some other podcasts, we saw a lot of growth in our store podcast about 2 years ago. So I was a reader of Anne's blog many moons ago. We met at a SIBA event. I was on her podcast, What Should I Read Next? She graciously agreed to come on From the Front Porch, and we got a ton of listeners that way. I don't have exact numbers for you, but we really did see an uptick in listeners based on cross-pollinating and having Anne on our podcast and me being on hers. Similarly, I love the Popcast, which is a pop culture podcast based out of Birmingham, Alabama. I'm a loyal listener of theirs. They talk about books sometimes. So I reached out to them 2 years ago and asked if they could link to the bookshelf instead of to Amazon. They still link to Amazon because that's where people's bread and butter comes from, but they often mention From the Front Porch. They talk about the bookshelf, and we have seen a huge uptick in listeners because of partnering with them. They frequently mention us on their podcast or on Instagram, and we always see an uptick in listeners because of that. So cross-pollinating with What Should I Read Next and with the podcast also helped us grow quite a bit. I see From the Front Porch primarily as a marketing tool, but it is a revenue stream for us. Now, it took a long time to get there. It took about 3.5 years before I really saw much ROI or return on investment from the podcast. And part of the way we do that, I have up for you our From the Front Porch website. People can listen through any avenue: Spotify, Stitcher, Overcast, Apple Podcasts. But if you're like my mom and you don't know how any of that works, you can listen through the From the Front Porch website. And we give in our show notes a list, just like anybody else does, a list of what books we've talked about, only instead of linking to, of course, Amazon, we link to our online store. And so it's an easy way where if you're listening, you're cleaning your house, you're listening to me talk, and you love the book I'm talking about, there is a way for you to purchase on our website quickly. So the link takes you straight to our online store and to where those particular titles were mentioned. We've also seen an uptick in our shelf subscribers. That's our monthly Book of the Month service. And this summer, we're having our first ever reader retreat because of long distance customers and podcast listeners who wanted to come see the bookshelf in person. We also do Patreon. Patreon is a service where our podcast is free, as it should be, but if you like what you hear and you want to hear more, then you can you can subscribe to kind of our Patreon feed for a small charge. So $1, $3, or $5 a month. And, that gets you some extra bonus content. Chris runs our Patreon page. And what's great about this, Chris is no longer a bookseller at the bookshelf. He is primarily just the podcast co-host and editor, producer, and he runs our Patreon page, and he earns half of our Patreon money. So that provides great incentive for him to continue to grow the podcast and to grow our Patreon support because it means an increase in income for him. So he earns half of our Patreon money. He also is paid for 5 hours a week of work. Recording a 30-minute episode of the podcast takes 30 minutes. Like Mitchell, we don't do a ton of editing. It's kind of conversational, but it does take time to produce it, to edit it, to get it out, so that the public can consume it. So I think for one 30-minute episode, 2 to 3 hours of work is fair. And I know that because I've done it before too. So we are at episode 221 of From the Front Porch. Again, you can find us wherever you get podcasts. You can find us on our store website too. And yes, it's a marketing tool. Yes, we have seen an increase in revenue, particularly in online sales. What I love is that this thing that started out as a way to promote us to our local community, yes, we have local support, but now what we see is just like people have bought into our Instagram feed or our social media, long distance customers now really liken us to their own local independent bookstore. They're, as Anne mentioned, hearing our voices every week. So they feel like they know us personally. And as much as I love, obviously, as a bookstore owner, an increase in sales, what I think you can't put a price tag on is that for a pretty inexpensive marketing tool, aside from hosting, which we do through Libsyn, this is pretty free, generally speaking. And we have fans and readers and customers all over the country that we did not have before. And so I think that is pretty invaluable. It's been a way to expand the brand of the bookshelf and the reach of the bookshelf, and giving people a chance to get to see what we do and why we do it. So. Okay.
I was curious for the presenters what some of your favorite podcasts are that you listen to. Some of you have mentioned that.
I don't listen to a ton of reading podcasts anymore because I'm nervous that there will be overlap. So
That makes me feel better. That's why.
Yeah. So I don't listen to book podcasts anymore, but I do listen to a lot of news podcasts, pop culture podcasts, but book and reading podcasts I steer away from because I'm so afraid, I guess. I don't want us to unintentionally start sounding like another podcast.
Similar with me. I don't listen to a lot of reading podcasts, but I do listen to a lot of podcasts that either present literature in one way or another. I listen to the New Yorker podcasts. I also listen to a lot of political podcasts like Pod Save America and some of the others as well. But I don't listen to a lot of reading podcasts. There's one that I like because I know him, and that's A Phone Call from Paul. I don't know how many of you know that one, but it's he ran the programming at the New York Public Library. And the notion of his podcast is he cold calls. Well, I don't think he cold calls, but it sounds like a phone call to an author. And he has a conversation with that author. And that's one that I listen to.
I love podcasts about the creative life, but not necessarily about the book life, because I don't want to live in my little echo chamber, as pleasant as that might be. Off Camera with Sam Jones is a favorite. And Annie, I'm echoing what you said, and then answering Nikki in chat, who said, how much time on average does it take to produce one podcast, including creating content and editing? And yours is 2 to 3. My one great book is probably 2 at this point for my 7-8 minute show. But What Should I Read Next takes 10 to 15 hours, only 3 of which are mine. But
yeah, I would say we're about 5 hours. And for me, it's probably 2 to 3 hours. Maybe it's 6 total, but for me, it's about half as much.
mm-hmm. And again, that goes back to we edit very carefully. We're talking to people who don't, editing the ums out of someone's conversation takes a million years, and we let it breathe. We don't take out anything by any means, though we will take out every speech click, because that's really painful to listen to if you're not actually there having the conversation. But editing people who aren't used to talking is difficult. But I always feel like I'm harder to edit, because I'll try 3 times to get the question exactly right.
Well, I have to say that both of you, when I listen to you, are inspirations, because it doesn't sound edited very much. And you're both so articulate without the ums that I just did. So, it's a pleasure to listen to you both. And you also get across that excitement about books, which is what it's all about.
At real events, I have to tell people, or in-person events, like I'm usually filtered. Watch out.
Yeah, we don't edit. We edit about, like I said, 2 to 3 hours per 30-minute episode. But Chris and I have been doing it a long time, so I don't think he edits a ton of the ums or ands out of it. I think it's really mostly just us talking, which may be why it really doesn't take too terribly long to edit an episode. It does feel like it takes a long time to record. Chris and I are both introverts, so we don't record for about 20 minutes to get in the rhythm of talking to each other again, and then we hit record. So it does take a little bit of time there.
And you batch process. You should talk about that.
Yeah, we record 2 episodes every 2 weeks, plus the occasional bonus content. So Chris is coming up from Tallahassee every other week. We record in person, and we record two-ish episodes. So then he only has to come to Thomasville every other week.
Yeah, and I'm recording, basically sometimes I may do 3 or 4 a week, depending on who's in town and what I'm doing. So I always have they're kind of stacked up. So if I can't get to some, I don't have the pressure of having to do it every week.
Right. Right. A lot of people do that. That's smart. Mine takes longer. So to prepare, and we talk for an hour and a half, or an hour to an hour and a half. But I try to do it on the same day, like to do 2 or 3 is a lot for me. Also an introvert, that is a whole lot of talking. But that way I only have to go to the podcasting place in my brain every 2 to 3 weeks. And we do, because like Annie said, the podcast she enjoyed listening to, she thought consistency was important. We always maintain a margin of at least a few weeks, so that if somebody gets the flu, or I live in the South, like there could be a tornado and the power is going to go out. But that we still have our show ready to go.
Well, what's interesting, I'm curious about Anne and Annie, how you feel. There are podcasts, obviously, even literary podcasts,
Mm-hmm.
that are highly produced.
Mm-hmm.
What is your feeling about that, just in general? And I noticed that they don't do as many. That some of the seasons may only have between 8 and 12 podcasts because they're so highly produced.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a preference you have in terms of both listening as well as what you think reader response would be or listener response would be?
I'm going to come at the question from another direction. I love Radiolab, not a literary podcast, but a highly produced podcast. Love it as a listener. But I don't know what specific podcasts you have in mind that are highly produced literary wise. I do know that I've talked to several literary podcasters who've contacted me and asked if we can have a heart-to-heart because they're thinking of quitting, because they do have a highly produced podcast. And even though they're kind of in your shoes, Mitchell, where they're not actually doing the editing, but they are doing everything else, the content creation, and oftentimes they have big deal interviews. But the question I have is this worth it? Because this is taking so much of my time. I either need a pep talk or a come to Jesus talk that says it's worth it, keep going, or honey, you got to quit.
Right.
So I'm just, I'm wondering if those are the same people.
Well, I was wondering in terms of analytics, is there some sort of rule about something that's more naturalistic in terms of tone, whether it's about literature, whether it's about anything else,
Mm-hmm.
versus something highly produced? I don't know. Obviously, you produce yours, really quite well. So it's just something I'm thinking about. Some of the ones, even the ones that I listen to, Podcast America, although it seems highly produced, it's not. It's more off the cuff. It's kind of.
Are you sure?
It may not be, but it sounds like it is.
Yeah.
It's
some of the best off the cuff shows are not off the cuff.
Yeah, but I'm thinking like of Danny. The one about secrets that she just started.
Oh yeah.
Danny Shapiro's one, which I know is really highly produced. But she's providing some of the content, but she's only doing 6 to 8 episodes a year,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know. I guess it supplements what she's doing to a large extent.
Yeah, I think it has to do with, too, what ours reflects to me from the front porch reflects, if you walk into the bookshelf and you've been a listener from the front porch, you're like, oh, this makes sense. Casual, conversational. It's very much the vibe of the bookshelf. I like listening to like This American Life or something like that that's highly produced and edited. I'm not capable of that, first of all. I'd have to pay somebody to do that. And second of all, it just doesn't match the vibe of the story. And so I think for me, that's where it comes down from. I imagine some of those highly produced shows perhaps do better in terms of analytics or things like that. But for us, for what we're trying to do, and we're not in Miami, meaning I don't have my point being, I don't have like big name authors coming on my show either. We're just in Thomasville kind of producing these conversations. But if I did have the opportunity to have authors, I might like, more produced content.
Well,
but for us,
my idea, the reason why I asked is for the people listening, I also am approaching it as very unscripted, even with authors that are well known.
Yeah.
Just like it's a conversation that we might have if we were just having a cup of coffee.
Mhm.
I bring that up only that the bar to entry is lower if you think of it that way, and not get intimidated by the idea that you're going to have to highly produce something.
Yes. I think I said it. We're not NPR, like
Right.
I love NPR, but I'm not capable of that.
Right. Well, and also, I'm sorry.
Oh,
We
just I was
have a
gonna say,
question when y'all are ready from someone else.
we're talking about scripting and sound effects and music, and that when we say highly produced, that's the kind of stuff we're talking about, as opposed to hitting record and talking into the microphone.
So someone is asking, how do you balance keeping a consistent format, this is for Anne, with keeping the product fresh and interesting for yourself as well as listeners?
That's a good question. So we do have the same format. People tell me 3 books they love, 1 book they don't, and what they're reading now. And I recommend titles they can read next. Talking about books never gets old, for one. Also, when we have regular readers on, we are vetting thousands of submissions. I don't see most of them, but we choose the books with care. Like if someone listens to the show and shows 3 books I talk about all the time is their favorites, they're not coming on the show, because maybe it would be a different conversation, but we always want new content. And then something we've done in the past year that we didn't do previously was we asked people, what might you like to talk about with Anne? So that's the blank where we find out, well, somebody had concussion complications and couldn't read literature for 9 months, and what that did to their reading life. A conversation that might not just unflow naturally, or I don't know, somebody quit their job and traveled the world for a year, or somebody's child was diagnosed with dyslexia and they had to figure that out as a reading family. Like, there's always something new to talk about. I mean, we're talking about books. That's a topic that is always the same and always new.
And has anyone considered or tried video, vlogging, I guess we'd call it? The platform would be different, but the idea and goal would be the same, right?
Do Instagram stories count?
Gotcha. Yes.
Annie, you do great stories.
I think Instagram stories is as much vlogging as I ever want to do. One of the things I was talking about when I gave my talk was that I wanted the podcast to be something sustainable that I could keep doing even if I lost the staffer who's kind of helping me. And the reason I say that is because we had an intern who loved YouTube and who started a YouTube channel for the bookshelf. And she did these great videos and it was super cute. And when she left, guess what? No more YouTube, because it's not something I have an interest in. And when you talk about vlogging, to me, for some reason, that seems like even perhaps more editing and producing than a podcast requires. Perhaps not. I think Instagram stories or even utilizing Instagram TV might be a fun option to do something like that. But otherwise, that's a little intimidating to me personally.
Something I do wonder about is if I was sitting in the shoes of a bookseller thinking about starting a podcast now, is if I wouldn't just fire up my Instagram stories instead. Somebody else has a platform. They can still get to know you. They can still know your voice. You can show them the store. You don't own any of the stuff and you're at the mercy of Instagram's algorithms, but it's a lot easier. I mean, you might have to actually put on clothes and brush your hair, which you don't have to do if you're podcasting, but you do have to do if you own a bookstore. So I work from home. I could podcast in yoga pants, but I do podcast in yoga pants. I could podcast in no pants, but I don't, because nobody wants to think about that.
Do you happen to know, just since the Instagram stories came up, is there a limit to how long an Instagram story can be?
There's a limit to how long people will watch them.
Okay.
I don't know if there's a limit on Instagram TV. Do you, Annie?
I do not know the answer to that, but I'll second Anne. I mean, we do Instagram stories, both me personally and the bookshelf all the time, and you can see people fall off the long It's very humbling.
And what is the time that they fall off? I mean, what is the optimum time that you've found?
I don't know. If I'm talking for more than 6 or 7 slides, even I get bored.
And
Like,
a slide is 15 seconds.
Yeah.
So it just
Okay.
looks like,
Thank you.
yeah. Yeah.
Also, I think there's a demographic thing going on. I think you tend to get a younger demographic on Instagram, and I think podcasting is something probably skewed a little older, I imagine, as well.
Also, I mean, there's no greater compliment than for someone to say, like, I listened to your show from Georgia to Utah. And you can't do that with Instagram.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can't do that with One Great Book now either. It would barely get you across the state line, but
Right, right.
One thing we talked about in the preparatory meeting was would you do this again? Like if it was today and you're going to start a podcast, would you reconsider doing it? Or do all of you, well, Mitchell, you're pretty new at doing this, but it's felt worth it for all of you?
I think for me, and we talked about this a couple weeks ago, but I'm glad I did it when I did, because there's something to be said for ignorance and for just kind of naivete, like diving into something. And sure, somebody said I should start a podcast, so I did. I feel like it was a little maybe less intimidating than it might be now, but I think that's why Mitchell's point was important, which is I don't think a bookseller or a bookstore owner has to think to themselves, how do I sound like Ira Glass? Like, I think instead, if you can just approach it as an arm of your store, just another way for people to get to know you and to get to know what you're doing, then it's not as intimidating. But for one, I'm glad I did it when I did it. It felt easier being ignorant.
Well, yeah. Go ahead, Annie. Or Anne. Was Anne?
Yes, that is very true. That's really it. I would also say though that I mean, some things don't get easier. It's not like this is going to become easier over time. So I'm glad I started when I did. But part of the reason is that starting at whatever stage is daunting, and we already did it. And
Yeah.
glad that's over with.
I've come to it sort of, late in my book selling career, and I'm loving it. I mean, just in the sense of, doing something new, something different. And I really am enjoying the interview format more than I thought I would. It's a little daunting because, particularly if you're stacking up a number of authors that are coming in, you may not, you hate to admit this, but I don't pretend that I do. You might not be able to have read all of the recent books of the person you're interviewing. So that's why my interview isn't necessarily always about the book that they're promoting. It's more about who they are, what they like to read, their journey of how they got from there to here. It's kind of just getting to know somebody in a way. And the dividends, the personal dividends, are just really wonderful. People find that out. Even if you're doing it just about a reader who comes in the store, as Anne is doing. Sorry for crossing names.
Jones and Bogle. That's what we got to do next time.
Yes.
Mitchell, I love shows like that. And that's something that we try to do as well if we ever have an author on. But sometimes when you have authors on, they're used to talking about their book. They have their talking points. They know how to do it. But they can have, and people ask them the obvious questions, sometimes provided by their publicist. So the conversation sounds the same no matter where they are. But to hear that weird little story about like their dog or what they're reading now, or I don't know, their third grade teacher, like those things that you don't expect to come up. Like I always listen close when I hear an interviewee say, no one's ever asked me that before. And on our show, when we do talk to authors, we try to talk to professional people, a third of the time or less, but we can't really get it to less. We tell them like, no, we're not going to talk about your book for 45 minutes, but this is your opportunity for people to connect to you as an individual and hear a side of you that they don't usually hear. And when people feel like they know you, they want to know more and they want to buy your stuff. So I think it works out as well or better in the end. I mean, good ad copy doesn't help, but they're interesting conversations that way.
Yeah, it's all, to be honest, it's about community. It's about extending what we do as booksellers.
Mm-hmm.
It's really what we're doing is we're giving people a place to interact with other people.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I'm trying to do in this podcast.
Mm-hmm. We do. Here, can I, broken record? We talk to regular readers, and sometimes we'll get complaints that say, you haven't had a regular reader on in like a couple months. What's going on? And I'll look at the list of who we've talked to, and I'll be like, no, we've talked to we've talked to people who are not professional book people. But what I found is that when people are talking about a subject they're passionate about, even with no training, except all the hours they spent reading their books, they sound interesting and fascinating and knowledgeable. I mean, they sound good. And it sounds like a conversation that you want to be a part of. And if you can't be sitting right there, the next best thing is to be sitting right there behind your steering wheel or at your kitchen sink. And just to be able to facilitate that kind of interaction with other readers is really rewarding.
It's a natural extension of book selling for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Does anyone have any more questions? We're getting close to the end of our hour. Maybe technical questions about, you three presenters mentioned the platforms that you use. Could you reiterate those? Where the sites where your podcast is available, how it's available, maybe?
We record in GarageBand, and we host our episodes through Libsyn, Libsyn. I think somebody typed it in the chat. And then you can find, because of Libsyn, you can find our podcasts anywhere you get podcasts: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Overcast, etc. But we also, probably 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, decided to have a separate website that you can click over from the Bookshelf website, but kind of a separate website to house kind of everything. It was easier to do that, to have a separate landing page for From the Front Porch.
We had that as well when Revolver was hosting it. You could go to the Revolver page, but they also had us everywhere else. And I think LitHub is the same thing. So LitHub now has its own. If you go to LitHub website, they have a drop down with all the podcasts that they host. But we're also, as Annie is, everywhere else, I think.
What Should I Read Next is with a network. So we are required to be on Art19, which is expensive and really stingy with downloads. Go for Libsyn. We love Libsyn.
Well, I think Revolver was Art19 as well, because we had to move everything over, and I think they did it through it.
Mm-hmm.
But I couldn't tell you the difference between one or the other, personally.
Money. Well, it's money, and the what counts as a download is a lot stingier in Art19 because of.
What network are you with? What network are you on?
Wondery.
Uh-huh.
An O. But
what is the advantage of a network? Do they help promote analytically, having people find your podcast? Is that what
in theory-ish, they sell all our ads is the main thing, and they'll enable a little bit of cross promotion, but the main thing they do is just sell all they serve as our advertising broker.
There's a question about specific microphones. Anne said Yeti. Do y'all have microphone recommendations?
Oh, I have a Yeti that my daughter uses for her Serial Club podcast, because I can't figure out how to use it. This is like a really cheap, can you see it? It's a USB Audio-Technica ATR 2100 USB. I read that it was the best value for the buck, $50. I paid extra for this little shield that was like $9.
I think we're using a Yeti as well. I'm not sure of that, but I believe so.
And we use Audacity to edit, which I understand is similar to GarageBand, but I only know how to use Audacity.
Well, we're almost to our time. Is there any more questions? Maybe Wanda, do you have a question?
I always have a ton of questions, but I also got notified just now that I have a conference call in 2 minutes.
Okay.
So I'm going to have to leave everyone, and I want to thank our presenters so much. And I daydream about, I want to have already started my podcast too. So I wish it was already started. That would make me happy, but that hasn't happened yet. So I don't know. I daydream about it all the time, but
when we
we'll see
started
what happens.
Great Book, we weren't sure if we could sustain 2. So we set it up, we committed to a 8-episode season. It's really short. I don't know if you
Yeah.
set up a format that allows you to experiment, then you can find out if you love it or you
Yep.
hate it, and you can make
Yep.
it better, or you can like flush it down the toilet,
Got it.
but you don't wonder about it anymore.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good idea. Thank you all.
Bye,
Great
Wanda.
to be with you.
Bye-bye.
Nice to see you all.
Thank you. Thank you, presenters. That was wonderful. And safe travels, Mitchell.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have office hours
Buddy.
until 5 o'clock. So if people want to stay on, you're welcome to. Otherwise, thank you for coming.